Without a doubt, 2023 has been a fantastic year if you're a Final Fantasy fan. From reliving the past with the Pixel remasters to rewriting the past with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth announcement and a brand new Final Fantasy in the series of Final Fantasy XVI. I plan on talking about 16 in the near future with the next episode of Play and Tell, but you can check out my impressions on the demo. And if you've been following me on social media, you guys know I've been really enjoying it. So, running off that high of Final Fantasy XVI, I thought I would celebrate the series even more by making a tier list of the main series. That's right, Final Fantasy 1 through 15, I'm making a top tier list. And again, as a disclaimer, this is my list, this is my opinion. But without further ado, let's get into it. Alright, so I have the tier list up, and I'm just going to go in order. Starting from the very first Final Fantasy, probably the most least final of all the Final Fantasies in this video. But Final Fantasy 1, okay? I am going to put Final Fantasy 1 on B tier. And here's why. I feel like Final Fantasy, it was my second introduction to the role-playing genre. My first being Dragon Warrior on the NES, and I feel like it's aged a lot better than the first Dragon Quest. But it's still a very basic sort of game, and I would not recommend the NES version, by the way. It's got some bugs and mistranslations, and there's just so many other ways to play Final Fantasy. I feel like this would be a great game for someone that wants to know the history, that wants to play all the Final Fantasies. You got to start from the very beginning. You got to start at the roots. Final Fantasy 2. Yeah. Final Fantasy 2 is going on the D tier. See, I commend Square. I commend them for wanting to do something different. But the problem is Final Fantasy 2 is just not a good game. It showed us a lot of things that would carry on with the series, like the introduction of Cid and Chocobos. But I did not like the fact that your character didn't really level up. It was a very weird experience system. If you wanted to have like really powerful fire, you had to use fire more. It was just, I don't know. I commend them for trying to do something different, riding off the success of the first Final Fantasy, but this ain't it, Chief. Next up is Final Fantasy 3, and that is going in the C tier. I'm not that big of a Final Fantasy 3 fan. I've only played it on the Nintendo DS. It was like the remake. It was the first time I was actually released in the States, and while it introduced the summoning class, and I believe it also introduced, Shiva and Ifrit and stuff like that, the job system was really cool, but it just felt very bland. Something about it, I need to go back and try it again, but it was such a grind fest. I really couldn't get into it, so it's average. Final Fantasy 4 is going straight to A tier. I know some folks really love Final Fantasy IV, and I think it's a fantastic game. I remember Final Fantasy II, as it's known on the Super Nintendo. I had a pretty good late fee from Blockbuster renting Final Fantasy II. It showed me a side of video games I had never seen before. It was very cinematic. It had a lot of character building, and it was the first time, without spoiling anything, that I dealt with characters in the video game dying. Not like just Mario falling down a pitfall, but it was just double sadness. But it's definitely A tier. Cannot recommend it enough. And next up is Final Fantasy V, and that is going into the A tier. Right beside Final Fantasy IV. Graphically, 5 didn't really do much more than 4 did. I felt like the story really took the back seat. The gameplay was really up front and center, especially with that job system. This is such a humble game. I love the theme song. The theme song to Final Fantasy V sounds like, John Williams' E.T. It's just something about it. It's a very charming game. Next up is going to be Final Fantasy VI. That is S tier. This is the gold standard, folks, when it comes to a wonderful JRPG. Final Fantasy VI is definitely one of the recommendations I would always put in high regard. It's like Black Sabbath Paranoid. It's just classic. It's got some of the best character development, and the fact that it captures so much emotion with little 16-bit graphics, my gosh. I cannot recommend this game enough. I'm so glad that many people get to play this game, and you never really hear anybody say, oh, Final Fantasy VI is overrated, because they're wrong. Final Fantasy VII, the cool Final Fantasy. And I'm putting it right there in S tier. And here's why. Because I know a lot of folks say that Final Fantasy VII is overrated. But listen, when Final Fantasy VII came out, if you were there, the ads, the advertisements were just unbelievable. I remember watching WCW wrestling Saturday night and seeing a Final Fantasy VII commercial and being like, wow, this is the future of video games on this new console called the Sony PlayStation. I got Final Fantasy VII for Easter, and I loved it. Final Fantasy VIII is an interesting game because I know a lot of people personally that absolutely love Final Fantasy VIII. And in a lot of ways, Final Fantasy 1 and 2, 7 and 8 share something very similar in the sense that 7 was super successful and 8 went in a different direction. Beautiful game, great soundtrack. The story is okay, but that junction system, I'm not a fan of the junction system. So what do I rate Final Fantasy VIII? Well, other than making rhymes, I'm going to put it on a C. I don't think it's a terrible game. I just don't think it's the game for me. Final Fantasy VIII is one of those games that taught me that you don't necessarily have to like good games for them to be good. And I think Final Fantasy VIII is a great example of that. Final Fantasy IX is S tier. My personal favorite Final Fantasy of all time. I love Final Fantasy IX. See, I grew up playing the original Final Fantasy, and I watched the progression through the years as much as I could growing up during the 90s, and a lot of my friends started with Final Fantasy VII. And when they saw 9, the art style really threw them in a loop. I knew some of my friends just did not care for it. They were like, well, what, it looks cartoony. And I was like, oh my God, back to crystals. It's back to medieval and fantasy, and something that we're just now starting to really embrace with Final Fantasy. I love it when they go to that deep-rooted fantasy look with the dragons and airships running on steam. The music of Final Fantasy IX. Zidane is one of my favorite heroes of Final Fantasy because he's like a womanizing pirate thief but with a heart of gold, and you see him change and grow as the story progresses. And let's not forget about Vivi. I could go on forever about how much I love Final Fantasy IX. 9 was like the closing of what we would know of Final Fantasy, because after Final Fantasy IX, 10 10 showed so many things that we had never seen in the series. Something as trivial as today's standards like voice acting. That was a big deal back then. And To Zenarken is one of my favorite songs in the Final Fantasy series. So what am I going to put 10? I'm putting 10 right there with 4 and 5. The only reason why it's not S tier is because as much as I don't mind linear games, I really didn't like the fact that it didn't have a world map. You know, I really wish I would have been able to roam and see, you know, the atmosphere that Final Fantasy X had, that island atmosphere. I really enjoyed that. I would have really enjoyed to actually free roam. That's the only thing that's keeping it, in my opinion, from the S tier. And of course, Final Fantasy XI. I got to play Final Fantasy XI, but unfortunately, by the time I was playing it, it was no longer the game that people grew up playing. What I mean by this is when I played Final Fantasy XI, it was just a couple of months before they shut down the servers on Xbox 360, and you can still play it on PC. But you know, originally it was a PS2 game, and I remember just the concept of it was awesome. I'm not an MMO player. I think they're fun, but they're just not for me. So Final Fantasy XI, giving it a C. I think it's C tier. Final Fantasy XII. Okay, Final Fantasy XII and another Final Fantasy I'll mention have something in common in the sense that I want to one day play them more and beat them. Because 12 I felt like I would have more fun if I went back and played it in Japanese. I don't like the voice acting in 12. I like the battle system. The hunts and the mercenary missions were a lot of fun. The battle system was fun. The music was okay. But I just couldn't click with it. So I'm going to put it with Final Fantasy 2. You know, I felt like the D tier was getting a little lonely. We got to keep things balanced. Final Fantasy 13. What a weird time for Final Fantasy fans. 13 was just very strange. I couldn't get into it. And it, unlike 12, where I'm like, oh, I want to go back to it, I don't want to go back to 13. I'm putting it right there with 12. Here's the thing. I even have the other sequels like Lightning Returns and stuff like that. I had those, but I keep saying I'll play those, but I have to beat Final Fantasy 13, and I just couldn't get into it. It was one of those games that a lot of my friends would say, hey, just keep playing it. It gets better after you've played it for 13 hours, and I don't have time for that. I don't like the linear aspect, and the story just didn't grab me. But that battle theme, you know what? That battle theme makes it go up to a C. Because I like the battle theme. Final Fantasy 14, another MMO, you know, and like I told you guys, I'm not an MMO player. But 14 gets S tier, and here's why. Because Yoshi P's awesome. If it wasn't for the success of 14, and you got to understand, 14 is a redemption story itself. Because when the game first came out, it was not that popular. It was really bad, actually. And they completely reboot it with A Realm Reborn. And that's when I jumped on it, and I really enjoyed it. But like I said, I just don't have the time for an MMO. But I enjoyed the events. I was playing with my friend Amy, her and I. We would play that in Final Fantasy 11, and we went to the Dragon Quest event. We hung out at Gold Saucer. It was fun. It was great. And you know, if you're curious about Final Fantasy 14, you can play for free all the way up to Heavensward. That's over 200 hours of content right there. That's insane. So yeah, it's S tier. Final Fantasy 15. I'm gonna put it in C tier, and here's why. This is another Final Fantasy I want to go back and beat because I put about 20 hours into it. Stopped playing it for some reason. I think Yakuza Kiwami was coming out and I wanted to play that. But now they have Final Fantasy 15 Royal, and I hear they've done so many updates to that game that it's almost like a whole new game. So I put it in C because I need to finish it, and C where it really needs to go, because I really enjoyed the like brotherly love, friendship with Noctis and his friends, and the modernness, like riding their Mercedes, whatever it was, down the freeway, listening to Stand By Me. That was weird. I think we can all agree. I like the art style. They look like they're in a J-pop band. That's pretty cool. But see, it's very sporadic. Very sporadic. It's almost like throwing paint in the wall and seeing what dries. So yeah, 15 for now is like a C. But I don't know. After some 16, I'm kind of wanting to go back and check it out.
So there you have it, folks. That is my personal Final Fantasy tier list, 1 through 15. I know some of you folks may agree with me, some may not agree with me, and that's okay. Leave a comment below. I'd love to hear some of your personal tier lists when it comes to the main line of Final Fantasy. And if you enjoyed this video and enjoyed this sort of content, a simple like gives me a lot of feedback. And also, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you're not missing out on any videos or future live streams. As always, I want to thank you guys for watching. Thank you so much for subscribing. And as always, happy gaming.